It's Miss Whiz. I'm going to be talking with y'all today about weathering, erosion, and deposition, and how over time these three processes will actually change the Earth's surface. So the first phase is called weathering. Weathering is the process of breaking down the Earth's surface. So we're taking large pieces of rock and large formation and turning them into itty bitty teeny tiny pieces. There's a lot of things that can do this, but there are two main categories. Physical weathering, also called mechanical weathering, and chemical weathering. And we're going to take a look at both. So our first example of physical weathering that we see is frost wedging. This occurs when water gets into an existing crack in the rock. That water freezes and turns to ice, which pushes on the sides of the rock and ultimately breaks that rock into two pieces. Here are some actual examples where this has occurred. And we know that because of how clean that split is. Why does this happen though with water? Okay, well, water has a really cool property that when it freezes, it expands. And you can actually see this at home. If you take a full water bottle that you're normally able to stand upright on your countertop, put it in the freezer and let it get completely frozen, and then try to stand it up and see if you can tell the difference. Another type of physical weathering that we have is called collision. These are like an avalanche or a landslide where large chunks of the surface are moving at a very rapid rate. So just like when you hear the word collision, you might think of a car crash. Both of these processes happen very fast and are very quick, like a car crash. So avalanche, landslides, those are types of collision. Another example is called abrasion. This is where you have waves crashing on the shore and are taking little pieces of that shoreline away each time. Or maybe you have wind that is carrying sand and is etching away at these larger rocks in a desert. Both of these are called abrasion because they're going to take a really long time to break down those rocks. This is more like how long it takes if you were to use a piece of sandpaper to smooth out a surface. It's going to take you a while. The last type of physical weathering that we have is called root wedging. Now, just like that first example with frost wedging, it's where we're going to split a rock, but instead of ice, it's the roots that are doing the splitting. So a seed or a sprout has been planted around, on, or underneath, and over time, those roots are getting in between those crevices of the rock and just causing it to completely split and break apart into smaller pieces of rock. The other type of weathering that we can have is called chemical weathering. And this is where it kind of comes from the inside out. The first example of chemical weathering that we have is called oxidation. And you will always be able to tell right away if it's oxidation because there is this reddish orangey kind of color. And that's because this is actually the rocks are rusting. Okay, there is iron in these rocks and minerals that are reacting with the air and the water around them that causes the rock to rust. Another example is called acid rain. And I know it looks scary, but again, this process is not overnight. This is not after one rainstorm. This happened over a long period of time. What do you think caused acid rain? If you said pollution, you would be correct. In cities that have high populations and high pollution rates, we see this effect a lot more, where statues or buildings may have been weathered away because of the pollution in the rain that's coming back down. We call it acid rain. Okay, so phase 2. Phase 1, we broke the rocks down into smaller pieces, either physically or chemically. Now what? Phase 2 is called erosion. Erosion is the process of moving the pieces of rock and sediment from one location to another. Well, I know that rocks don't move on their own, so what's doing the moving? We call these things agents of erosion. Water, wind, ice, and gravity all have the ability to move those pieces of rock. And remember that large pieces of ice or land are called glaciers. Okay, so we've broken all these things down. We've moved them. Now what do? This is where phase 3 comes in. Deposition. Deposition is the process of dropping the pieces of rock and sediment into a new location. So we've broken them into smaller pieces, we've moved them, and now we've dropped them. Well, so what? What does that mean? What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that deposition shifts or makes new landforms. All of these different features have been created through the process of deposition. Deltas are formed when sand and small sediments are carried by the river and deposited at the end of the river where it opens up into the ocean. As more and more is deposited, it widens the area that the river has to go around, and we get this kind of triangular shape called a delta. Sandbars are kind of very similar, in which the ocean currents are pulling sand off of the beach and depositing that sand a little bit further out and creating this kind of pop-up island called a sandbar. And then I think you all can recognize that last picture as being sedimentary rock, where you get layer and layer and layer and layer stacked on each other. These smaller sediments have been deposited on top of each other, and over time, it's going to form this new sedimentary rock. So that's that. Weathering, erosion, deposition, changing landforms. That's all I got for you guys. Have a good one. Bye.